This is the Paul McGuire Report. I'm Paul McGuire. Things have changed. Not quite 180 degrees, but things have changed. Since the last program that we did, where we talked about the power of intercessory prayer, the power of law-abiding spiritual warfare, where we talked about the fact that when the church understands the supernatural power that God has given each individual, who is a supernatural part of the body of Christ, the supernatural body of Christ on earth, where Jesus Christ has given his church the keys of the kingdom, the power to bind demonic forces, the power to bind the spirits unleashed from the pit in the last days. The church has been given the supernatural power to defeat those demonic forces. So what always happens is when the church goes into spiritual warfare, I'm not talking about playing church. I'm not talking about feminized Christian men. And by feminized Christian men, I'm not talking about superficial or external mannerisms in which some people prejudicially disparage those individuals because they don't fit some kind of stereotype of like the old movie star from other generations, John Wayne. I'm not talking about a return to a John Wayne image of masculinity or, Sylvester Stallone or whoever. I'm not talking about that. When I'm talking about a feminized Christian male, I'm talking about a male who has been spiritually neutered, incapable of acting in his God-given function as a leader. And I'm also talking about, it's kind of an oxymoron, but feminized Christian women. By feminized Christian women, I'm not talking about feminine women who dress and act feminine. I'm not talking about external mannerisms. I'm not talking about superficial judgments based on whether somebody's wearing a dress or pants or makeup or no makeup or whatever. Those are all detours that the lockdown, mind control, mass media puts out there to divert from the real issue. Now, America has been under siege for months, and this siege is not a spontaneous popular uprising. This siege is not simply people exercising freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, etc., because this siege has been a violent siege. Violence on both sides of the fence. On one hand, we have... See, here's the problem. The major problem is you send millions of young people into the universities and the colleges and the high schools to get an education, and they don't get an education. And I'm talking about Christians too, because the vast majority of Christians, not all, but the vast majority of Christians that I meet who are the graduates of Christian schools are not any more educated most of the time than their secular counterparts. I mean, it doesn't matter whether you're dumbed down in a Christian educational institution or you're dumbed down in a secular public school education. The bottom line is, it really doesn't matter how you got there. You're dumbed down. You have no clue what's going on. And the reason you have no clue what's going on is because you have no knowledge. And when you have no knowledge, you have no power. And when you have no power, you are a victim. And when you are a victim, you are being set up incrementally to be a slave, taken over, to be conquered, and then trampled upon. And then finally, sorry to rock your little placebo world of falsehoods. By the way, a falsehood is a lie. No lie is of God. Satan is the father of lies. Why does the evangelical church educate their children with falsehoods, naivetes? Our nation is moving headlong into a coup. There is a planned revolution to destroy a free United States of America. That revolution is not theoretical, as it was when I was a young man, 14 years old, 15 years old, when I was demonstrating with the radical activist Abby Hoffman, when I was being trained by the radical activists in Manhattan, New York City, when I was hanging out with Timothy Leary, when I was made an honorary member of the Black Panther Party, the original Black Panther Party. That always upsets people I debate with on television because they want to put me in a predictable bubble upon which they hope to feebly attempt to destroy my argument by saying, well, that couldn't have possibly been. Well, sorry to break it to you, I was an honorary member of the Black Panther Party. I can show you the location where I signed up, the former Black Panther headquarters in Corona, Queens, New York. And the reason I was made an honorary member of the Black Panther Party was I was 14 years old when I went down there to sign up, to volunteer. I was naive. I was the victim of propaganda, like these people demonstrating in the streets. I was being subtly brainwashed, but I never bought it. You see, I never bought it as a young man. I had the utopian naivete to believe that this movement, this what they used to call the revolution, would bring about a better world. But I never bought into the doctrines of communism or Marxism because I had a certain degree of education, and it was obvious to me Marxism never delivered a free country or a prosperous country, and neither has communism. They always bring about slave states, with no exception. So I have a certain amount of empathy for the people demonstrating, but that doesn't mean I agree with them, because if their agenda was to proceed full speed ahead, and there are very powerful people backing them, powerful billionaires backing them, massive foundations from trillionaire families backing them, and it's all based on a lie. And the lie is that America is totally evil. It's a lie to say that America is systemically racist. That's not to say that America doesn't have racism. It does. That isn't to say that America doesn't have racial problems. It does. But in comparison with any other nation, the amount of racial equality, the amount of opportunities for people of different racial groups is astronomical. Who in their right mind would come to the United States of America with all of America's faults? And by the way, let's remind ourselves that there's no nation on planet Earth that isn't riddled with faults. And every nation on planet Earth is more flawed, has more racism, and more faults than America has. That doesn't justify our faults. That doesn't mean we don't need to have growth. But you don't get growth, you don't produce racial equality by stirring up and having trillionaires finance racial revolutions, with the end game being race wars. And that's their end game. But do you think that these billionaires and trillionaires care at all about people from different racial groups, ethnic groups, minorities? They don't care at all. They despise them. Why do you think the vast majority of the people who are in Antifa are white boys from privileged, wealthy backgrounds? The same thing was happening when I was a kid, when they were recruiting people for the Weather Underground in Central Park. I remember them trying to recruit me, the Weather Underground, trying to recruit me in Central Park, Manhattan. I wasn't interested in it. Their slogan was Armed Love, with AK-47 t-shirt, emblem that said Armed Love, with a picture of an AK-47. I said to myself, this is, you know what? This is a word that I'm not going to use right now on the radio program, but this is a lie. What they were trying to do is hijacked the hippie movement, the peace, love, Woodstock movement, and their goal, because they were They were led by communist organizers, Marxist organizers, receiving millions, hundreds of millions of dollars from the world's elite bankers were financing their revolution. The world's sellout media back then, the New York Times selling out, promoting Abbie Hoffman, not telling you the truth about Abbie Hoffman, that he wasn't an idealist, he was a communist. He said that maybe 20 years later. And Abbie Hoffman committed suicide. Now, I'm sorry that any individual has to commit suicide, but I suspect his perverse ideology of hatred for America, that the demons he summoned on others came back upon him. And he couldn't take it anymore, and he took his own life. Because communism and Marxism, he boastfully proudly boasted that he was a communist. That's not a happy song to sing. There's no God, as John Lennon sang as his anthem to the New World Order. Imagine there's no heaven. Imagine there's no nations or countries. Imagine there's no money. Imagine there's no God. Imagine a godless, utopian, Marxist, globalist world. That really is an accurate translation of the ex-Beatle singer's John Lennon's song. And by the way, to show you an endless example of the hypocrisy of the radical left, as John Lennon and Yoko Ono were in their apartment complex there were two tower buildings that face Central Park, very prestigious address. I imagine the inside of their apartment was massive. As they were shooting up heroin and following the occultic, mystic, clairvoyant teacher Edgar Casey, they were singing, imagine there's no God, imagine there's no heaven, imagine there's no hell. Okay, fine. Well, if we're going to imagine that, then why are you seeking some kind of transcendent spirituality by becoming disciples of the occultist Edgar Casey? And why are you shooting up heroin? And then you blab about imagine there's no money and all the rest of that garbage in your song. And yet, when you tragically died, and I like the music of John Lennon, not all of it, but I liked a lot of it. He was tragically gunned down. My personal opinion, the person who gunned him down was programmed through MKUltra. I'll leave it at that and let you figure out the rest. If you can't figure out the rest, then read my book, A Prophecy of the Future of America. It'll tell you what happened. So, he was tragically gunned down, and then when he died, which was a tragedy, it turns out that he and Yoko, and this was back, I don't know how many decades ago, had socked away over $500 million in their bank account. His song about imagine there's no money and all the rest of that stuff was a lie. See, communism, Marxism is a utopian philosophy. It is really the ideological equivalent of shooting up heroin. Because you see, when you're stoned out of your mind, you can't think rationally. And only someone whose brain has been bombarded with the biochemical release of heroin could compose and sing a song about imagine there's no more money, imagine there's no poor and rich, and then secretly and simultaneously hoard away $500 million. Now, let's not forget the $500 million that ex-Beatle John Lennon stashed away in his multiplicity of investments. What that amount of money would have been worth in today's value would have been probably $1 billion at least. Lennon would have been a billionaire. He would have been a billionaire. The amount of money he had was obscene. He was a super capitalist while pretending to be some, hippie artist, barefoot poet, he wasn't some hippie artist and barefoot poet. He was a billionaire telling others that they should be voluntarily poor. So here we have a ricochet, a rebound from the matrix, if you will, of this same philosophy, except now, just like the 60s, 70s counterculture, which I personally was part of, this new wave of protests is now weaponized, militarized. Notice it started fading. You see the hippie flowers, the songs, the love, the peace, make love, not war, all that stuff, the communes, flowers in the air and all that stuff. That faded when I was 15, 16, 17 years old. How did it fade? Altamont Speedway, when the Rolling Stones performed in California and they hired the Hells Angels to be the bodyguards for the massive rock and roll concert where allegedly a man was murdered to death by the Hells Angels right in front of the stage. I think it was when Jagger was singing Sympathy for the Devil, their hit song. And you could see the hippie movement was making a wild turn from peace, love, and Woodstock to armed love, communist revolution, as the Weather Underground infiltrated the hippie movement and turned it into a SDS, Students for a Democratic Society, revolutionary force based on the principles of Chairman Mao and the communist revolutionaries. It began then. And now we see, decades later, the militarization has flowered. So Antifa and Black Lives Matter, especially Antifa, is composed largely of spoiled, rich white boys and spoiled, rich white girls. These are the exact same spoiled, rich kids that were the that were the violent radical activists of the 60s and 70s. Remember Patty Hearst, the heir to the Hearst publishing empire? How she was brainwashed or whatever, or allegedly brainwashed. Who knows what the real story is? And she joins a ultra-radical black revolutionary group called the Symbionese Liberation Army. And they were arrested robbing a bank. How did one of the wealthiest capitalist heirs, female, how did she go from being a palatial queen of the daughter of a super capitalist trillionaire? How did she end up being a member of the radically armed revolutionary Symbionese Liberation Army? So now we are with Antifa, same thing, programming the disenfranchised young youth. Except this time, you have millions and millions of people who have been indoctrinated in the universities and the schools and the evangelical churches and the evangelical seminaries and the evangelical colleges are also being penetrated and under intellectual assault by tried and true Marxists. And then you now have entire Christian denominations. The first one, the Southern Baptist Convention, but other huge denominations, so-called evangelical and charismatic denominations, who are following the Marxist doctrine of critical race theory. And I'm going to remind you, critical race theory, or theological schools of higher criticism upon which critical race theory is based, that was developed by the Frankfurt School Marxists, who were communist professors who planned out a cultural revolution for America and the Western countries of the European nation. And it was primarily a cultural revolution and a revolution where you would change language and you would control the people's minds through the brainwashing technique of political correctness. And political correctness ideology. So then, because you have at this same time as the communists are fervently heating up, they were heating up back then. The communists were heating up back then. They were shooting to kill. They were arming. They were organizing, while evangelical Christians slept in their slumber. And by the way, when you're sleeping in your slumber spiritually, that is the opposite. That is the total opposite of revival. When we say America needs a third biblical Great Awakening, the concept of a Great Awakening is that the people of God stop sleeping spiritually. They wake out of their slumber spiritually, and they're awakened by a return to the Word of God, and they're awakened by the power of the Holy Spirit. They repent from their idolatry. What's the idolatry? You're worshiping. You got evangelical seminaries and churches worshiping Marxist doctrine, dressed up as seeker-friendly dynamics, but seeker-friendly dynamics that were created by the Marxist professors of the Frankfurt School. Don't you think there's something wrong there? Since when does Jesus and the biblical God instruct us to get our evangelistic principles, our church growth principles, our fellowship principles, our interpretation of the Bible principles? Since when does the Bible teaches us that? Does the Bible teach us that we're supposed to follow Marxist, godless revolutionaries to evangelize? No. So why is it being done? Apostasy. The great apostasy warned about in the Bible, and we're going to get to it in just a second and expose the root of the revolution you're seeing in the streets of America. And by the way, like all communist revolutions, you seduced the idealists. You seduced the dumbed-down evangelicals. You, as Abby Hoffman said, who I demonstrated with when I was 14 years old, you organize the discontent. That's what they're doing, and their goal is to topple America. And in their new America, do you think there's a place for you? How naive can you be? Was there a place for the Jews in Hitler's Nazi Germany? Hitler was a National Socialist. Let me ask you again, despite all his rhetoric about a new Germany, was there a place for the Jews in Hitler's Nazi Germany? Was there a place for true Bible-believing Christians in Hitler's Nazi Germany? Of course not. They were being fattened up with propaganda, and then they were slaughtered in the gas chambers and in the ovens of places like Auschwitz and the other Nazi concentration camps, because that's where communist Marxist revolutions always lead, without exception. You better wake up, and you better wake yourself up by the power of God, and you better be an agent of God to wake up your brothers and sisters, because if you don't wake up your brothers and sisters, you're going to find yourself in a concentration camp or a re-education camp that will be like Hotel Rwanda. You need to see the movie Hotel Rwanda. It's an excellent, excellent movie. It's bloody, but it's not gratuitous blood and violence. It's the true story of a faction of radicals in Africa, where one tribal group is assigned and militarized by covert forces they ambushed and they slaughtered 1 million innocent black children and adults with hatchets and machetes and machine guns. They slaughtered 1 million. But the movie's a tender movie. You say, well, what do you mean it's a tender movie? It's a tender movie because the whole movie, Hotel Rwanda, is about it's about a black man trying to save his family, trying to save innocent children, and to get them out of this Nazi-esque hellhole. It's not a movie that glamorizes violence. It's very tender, combined with a very sobering message. It's tender, it's moving, it's about love. To be educated, you need to expose yourself to movies like Hotel Rwanda. You want to see what a full-fledged Marxist-type revolution looks like in a third world nation? Watch Hotel Rwanda. You're listening to the Paul McGuire Report. I'm Paul McGuire. For your sanity, for truth, for power, for justice, the American way, and most of all, for the Lord Jesus Christ, visit paulmcguire.us. That's paulmcguire.us. We'll be back in a moment. You are listening to the Paul McGuire Report. I'm Paul McGuire. So what we have is a configuration, a synthesis of different forces. The majority of these forces are designed specifically. They're part of a master plan that has been unfolding in the United States of America since at least the late 1800s. Now you say, why then? Because it was then that communism was taking off. And in 1917, the Communist Revolution, formerly known as the Bolshevik Revolution, which was financed by the supercapitalists, by Wall Street, by the billionaires, by the international bankers. It was the super rich that financed the Communist Revolution, which overthrew the Tsar. The people were not oppressed under the Tsar, by the way. They could have done better, absolutely, economically. But if you contrast what life was like for the average Russian citizen under the Tsar, they were doing okay. Not great, but they were doing okay. They had a certain amount of freedoms. And then when the Communist Revolution threw out the Tsar and took over Russia, they were no longer okay. They lost all their freedoms. They lost all their prosperity. And to put it bluntly, Russia became a dark, Satan-infested hellhole. Communist Russia became hell on earth. Tortures, re-education camps, throwing your political enemies into psychiatric hospitals, shooting them up with drugs, and calling them insane because they didn't agree with the Communist Revolution. They call that technique the politicalization of psychiatry or psychology. In other words, you use psychology or psychiatry and the drugs that come with it as a methodology of political enslavement. So they would take their political enemies, and a political enemy, they were great intellectuals and writers and authors and thinkers in Russia, but they opposed communism. And by opposing communism, the Communist Party leaders identified them as insane based on the fact that they didn't agree. In other words, the clinical diagnosis that the communist psychiatrists made was that they would diagnose any dissenter, anyone who didn't go along with the communist revolution was categorized as insane, locked up in a concentration camp or a mental hospital, drugged out of their minds, chained to the wall, left in there for decades. This is how communism and Marxism, by the way, that's a classic example of what they would call free speech. There is no free speech. You criticize the communist dictatorship, you're shot, killed, tortured, whatever. This is what is beginning to happen here in the United States of America. Now, the critical thing that we have to understand is that when you see the violence on the streets of America, it's nihilistic violence. It's anarchy. It's it's meaningless violence. It's irrational violence. For example, Senator Rand Paul he was almost killed, right? If you looked at the footage of when he was being attacked by the demonstrators with his wife, there was a mass of turbocharged, angry revolutionaries that knew who he was to some degree, and they were going to kill him. If it wasn't for just four cops stood between him and them being slaughtered and others being slaughtered. Communism breeds anarchy and violence. So what does this mean? It means that America has now deteriorated down to two competing political parties, or two different political ideological worldviews. What I'm saying now is not a partisan political statement. I'm not talking about the Democratic Party as being evil, the Republican Party as being good. The complexity of the battle is deeper than that. It's the ideologies that are held by people in these parties. For example, in the Republican Party, there are many globalists. There are many agents of powerful secret societies that attempt to rule the United States and the world. Yeah, they're Republicans, and they're ruthless, and they're globalists, and they're connected to the international bankers. The Republican Party is not equivalent to sainthood. When you have people that are called never Trumpers in the Republican Party, people like Bush and the Bushes, people like, what's his name, Romney. How can you be a true conservative? How can you be a true conservative, a capitalist? How can you really stand for Christian values and then at the same time say that you would never vote for Trump, and then at the same time you're going to do everything you can to prevent Trump from being elected, and yet at the same time you're going to vote for Biden or Kamala Harris or whatever, and yet cling to this lie that you're a conservative, that you're a Christian, that you believe in Christian values. That is a complete and utter lie. And so there are many Christians in this nation that need to wake up and not to be so superficially seduced. The Bush family has never been authentically genuine Christian family. Their first allegiance is to Skull and Bones and the globalist program. The same with Romney, a member of secret societies, a globalist, and a friend of the international bankers. These are the exact same people that the heads of the Democrat Party are friends with. So you see, what we have in the Republican Party is a secret contingent of globalists, occultists, members of secret societies who masquerade under the guise of the American flag and Christianity and patriotism, etc. How can you look in your conscience and vote for a Marxist candidate and then call yourself a Romney or a Bush? You can't. You can't. Jesus Christ said a tree is known by its fruit. So if the tree claims to be conservative, Christian, Republican, patriotic, yet its fruit is communistic, Marxist, globalist, connections with the international bankers, all exemplified and demonstrated by the ravenous support and energy that men like the Bushes, they were behind NAFTA, GATT, CAFTA. The Bushes were behind all the lousy trade treaties that destroyed the income of the American middle class and the working class. And they knew full well what they were doing, and they were complicit in the demise of the middle class and the working class in America. You look at the news footage just from the other day, and you see Portland, which has been a hellhole of Marxist, nihilistic, anarchist revolutionary actions. And I'm not giving a full endorsement of this group. I don't even know who the group were. But a whole bunch of people, it looked like hundreds and hundreds of people driving pickup trucks, waving American flags, looking like working class, middle class Americans who literally invaded downtown Portland. And it was a strange sight. You saw all these pickup trucks, all these women and men who were Trump supporters move right into Portland with their pickup trucks, their flags, their motorcycles, and other vehicles. And basically, these so-called tough radicals, they fled. They ran. They couldn't handle it. They couldn't handle anybody standing up to them. They couldn't handle anybody not being afraid of them. And these Trump supporters moved into Portland, and basically these anarchists and Marxists fled. They ran. And, I'm not for violence. I'm not for physical confrontation on the streets, but somebody has to take a stand. Somebody has to stand up for what's right. Somebody has to have a spine. Because if you don't have a spine, you see this belief that if this was the belief that ancient Israel continually made and has made in recent history, which has been a military miscalculation. Whenever ancient Israel stopped putting their faith in the God of the Bible, whenever ancient Israel began to give away the land that God gave them, the land of Israel, whenever ancient Israel gave up land in order to secure peace from the surrounding pagan nations, they were always slaughtered. They always went into slavery and captivity. They always lost the battles. The only time Israel won was when they refused to give up land for peace, when they fervently worshipped the biblical God of Israel in the Bible. And when they refused to give up land for peace and they had faith in God, then they were able to successfully occupy the land. The Bible teaches us that the practice of retreating, the practice of accommodating land or ideology or beliefs or downtown cities or states or a nation, the idea of accommodating or surrendering land and territory for peace never works. Now, you'd think some of these liberal politicians would grasp this, giving in to the violent demonstrators and giving them, geographic cities like Portland and other places and St. Louis. It never delivers the peace. You think, okay, we're going to be nice guys and we're going to give the demonstrators or the rioters or whatever, we're going to give them land for peace. It never plays out that way. When you give them, let's say, downtown Portland, they want all of Oregon. It only inflames their passions. It only energizes their movement. But when somebody dares to stand up to them, like these Trump supporters did, driving in with endless miles of pickup trucks and motorcycles and stuff the other day, these so-called tough, angry demonstrators ran for their lives. Again, I'm not for physical violence. I'm not for physical confrontation. By the way, what I observed of the Trump supporters is that they were restrained and peaceful. No, they didn't take any guff. They didn't back down, but they weren't violent. They didn't cross the line. People weren't getting shot. Things weren't being burned down. It was an aggressive protest for freedom, but it was not a violent or evil protest. And the Church of Jesus Christ in America better wake up to those basic historical, sociological dynamics. There's this mentality in the church especially embraced by the seeker-friendly church, which goes something like this. Because, by the way, seeker-friendly theology was created by communist Marxist professors in the Frankfurt School in Germany in the 1920s. And the basic theory is, if we accommodate to the culture, if we meet their heartfelt needs, if we bow to them, if we give up land for peace, that somehow we'll evangelize them, and somehow we will save America, etc., etc. Notice that doesn't work. Notice that doesn't fly when you're trying to do that with anarchists, etc. Now, in a moment, I want to explain to you from history. I want to prove to you what many people can't seem to wrap their brains around, which is it was the communist revolutions were all financed by super capitalists, the wealthiest men and women in the world, by the international bankers and the globalist elite. The communist revolution was never financed by the poor masses of workers. It was financed by a super capitalist, super wealthy elite class. So visit paulmcguire.us, get yourself a copy of these books, The Greatest Battle for the Hearts and Minds of Mankind in the History of the World. I go through all the stuff I'm talking about now in detail and with documentation. Get yourself a copy of Conquering the Matrix, which is about destroying mind control over cities and individuals. And get yourself a copy of the 2-volume set, A Prophecy of the Future of America, Volume 1, and then Volume 2. And you can get these in book bundles. And then finally, get yourself a copy of the book that I'm going to read to you now on the radio, which is called The Day the Dollar Died, which exposes how the international bankers, the biggest banking firms, the biggest financing firms, they financed the communist revolution. And we're going to expose what their master plan is for America in the near future. You're listening to the Paul McGuire Report. Help us spread this message far and wide while we still have anything left of a free media. Look. If the election goes the wrong way, do you think this kind of communication is going to be allowed on the internet? Are you really so naive as to believe you're going to continue to receive free speech, freedom of thought, freedom of religion over the internet, over social media, over that kind of communication system? Do you really think that's going to continue? No, it won't continue. It will be locked down and censored, all for your own good. Those are lies. You're listening to the Paul McGuire Report. Visit paulmcguire.us. We don't have much time, folks. I mean, the clock is ticking. That's what I was trying to say with the photo back cover of The Greatest Battle for the Hearts and Minds of Mankind in the History of the World, where there's a picture of me standing by a clock in Grand Central Station, and the time is midnight. I'm trying to say with that picture is that we are at the midnight hour. That means unless we win, it's over. Now, you can go off on a theological, heretical side show. You can make believe that Jesus is going to rapture you like next Tuesday, and you won't have to face the consequences, but that's not what the Bible teaches. You don't know when Jesus is going to return. I don't know when Jesus is going to return. And besides that, Jesus not only said no man knows the day or the hour, only God the Father does, but Jesus Christ also said that as Christians we're to occupy what? Occupy the land that we live in until he comes. That means not giving. God has a prophetic plan for America, for crying out loud. Read the entire history of it in my book, The Greatest Battle. The Pilgrims and Puritans came here, entered into a supernatural covenant with God based on Deuteronomy 28. God honored it, and God has a prophetic plan for America and your life. And we will either realize and bring to maturity that prophetic plan, or we will be unfaithful, disobedient, and we will go into captivity and oppression. It's not the will of God for America to go into captivity and oppression. That would only happen if God's people continue to ignore the prophets, the watchmen on the wall, and to continue to ignore history. Spread this message far and wide. We don't have much time. And you need to light a fire on some of your friends and bring them alive, both spiritually and intellectually. And none of this passivity. Oh, I can't vote for anybody because they're not perfect enough. Well, wake up, fool. Jesus Christ is not running for president. Mortal men and mortal women are running for president. So you pray over and you choose the best candidate based on this principle. Which candidate is going to do the most to adhere to biblical principles? That and only that is the basis for your decision. If you're going into an election and the question you're asking is this: which candidate is going to personally benefit me better, and to hell with the rest of the country? God's not going to bless that kind of attitude. You'll be under a curse. You want to be under the blessing of God. This is Paul McGuire. We'll be back in a second. Visit paulmcguire.us. Spread these links far and wide. By the way, YouTube, very interestingly enough, has now, across the board, this means everyone who has a YouTube channel. YouTube used to allow people to send out YouTube messages, YouTube pictures. But now they don't allow that. They've severely restricted the number of YouTubes that anyone can send out, not just a select few. It's a global policy. Why do you think that is? Why do you think it is just a couple of weeks before an election, your power to communicate to lots of people like your friends through YouTube, etc., has all of a sudden been mysteriously unplugged? In other words, they've unplugged and canceled out your ability to mass communicate to your friends. Now, why would YouTube and the other social media companies do that? Because they're trying to rig the election. They're trying to rig the election in favor of their masters, because they are pawns of the globalist elite, the international bankers, and the men and women who want to destroy our nation so that they can create a one-world government, a one-world religion, a one-world economic system. So they want to destroy your freedom of speech, your freedom of the press, your freedom of religion, by denying you the technology you had over the last numbers of years. And when do they do it? Right during election time. They don't want you to communicate. They don't want the people of America to communicate their beliefs and their opinions on different candidates, Republican or Democrat. So they have literally castrated your ability to send out messaging on a wide scale. Wake up. These people are not your friends. They're owned by the globalist elite. This is Paul McGuire. We'll be back in a moment. Knowledge is power. You're listening to the Paul McGuire Report on Paul McGuire. I want to take a quick side note before I get into exposing the names, the institutions, the globalist institutions which are controlling the riots and demonstrations. These same institutions own, that's right, they own all of the mainstream media. I have been warning about this coming communist, Marxist, New Age, hardcore socialist revolution. I've been warning about it in my books, conferences, radio programs, national televised debates on Fox News, CNN. I've been warning about it in my 34 books. I've been warning about it by speaking all over the world. And let me tell you what the reaction has been. There has been a remnant church that has rallied behind me. People who really love the Lord Jesus Christ and love His Word. They've rallied behind me. People like you who have supported the ministry by being intercessory prayer warriors, by supporting the ministry, by sending our messages far and wide, by seeking God and supporting this ministry financially with your generous gifts and contributions. Because of your partnership, we have been able to stay at the forefront of the spiritual battlefield. But everything that's happening now, I warned about in explicit detail. You can read the previous books. Go to paulmcguire.us. You can save money on discount book bundles and read what I've written, what I've exposed going back during the years. None of this is new to me because I used to be a radical activist myself because I was raised in an atheistic, highly liberal household and participated personally in the radical demonstrations of the late 60s and 70s. I was demonstrating when I was 14 years old in Manhattan. Now, it's very interesting that as we move into election time, as to be expected, scandalous stories erupt. They erupted during the last election. Scandalous stories were used to attempt to discredit the President of the United States. Scandalous stories were used to attack both, like Bill Clinton when he was running, Trump when he was running, and then you have the steady expose of religious leaders. Now, I want to preface what I'm saying by making a very clear statement. I am in no way apologizing for, defending the immoral actions, the sinful activities, the hypocrisy, the double standards, the selfishness that can exist and does exist in a certain percentage of ordinary churches and, let's call them, religious empires. I am not defending that. I am not defending hypocrisy. I am not watering down God's holy law. I'm not watering down God's holy and righteous standards. When we violate those standards, there's a penalty. So I'm not sweeping that under the carpet, okay? But it's not an accident that just a couple of days ago or a week ago or whatever, a story breaks on Jerry Falwell's son, and a story breaks about Jerry Falwell's son's wife, Becky Falwell. And what I'm about to say now is from a news report, but it is certainly not suitable material for young children and children, and it's not suitable for other age categories. So before I get into, I'm going to deal with this as tactfully as I can, but it has to be dealt with. And so I'm giving you, I'm going to count to 10 as a warning that we're going into an adult subject. It has to be covered. And then I'll give a countdown as we go out of it. This will prepare any mother or father from exposing their children to unsuitable material. And I would definitely consider this unsuitable for young children. So I'm going to give you a count to 10 before we move into the story with the Falwells. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Here we go. Okay, there have been numerous media reports in the last week or so about I'm going to say alleged, because I'm not a lawyer. I haven't been through a courtroom process. I don't know how this is going to finally be determined legally. So I'm going to call it alleged, okay? So a former Liberty University student, and I'm going to say, since I don't know if it's true or not, it could be true, but it's being taken very seriously. He claims that allegedly Becky Falwell Jerry Falwell's son, who was up until recently, was the president of Liberty University and the ministry there that his father, Jerry Falwell, left behind for him. He accused Becky Falwell of, this is going to be objectionable, so I'm going to censor it even more. This former Liberty University student, I think he was 22 years old at the time, alleges that Becky Falwell climbed into bed with him as a young student, and let's just put it this way, and performed a sexual act on the young man one evening back in 2008 while he was staying over, allegedly, at the Falwell's home. Okay, so he said that according to the student, this is from Politico magazine, according to the student, he told Politico magazine that the wife of then university president Jerry Falwell Jr. initiated the act, and he went along with it. So I guess I'm not going to get into the lurid details. That's not what this program's about. But in other words, see, I don't want to spill this out in a pornographic type of reporting. So I'm censoring even further. Anyway, supposedly Jerry Falwell Jr. encouraged the act because this was a group activity, and I'll leave it a group sexual activity, and I'll leave it at that. Okay. He said that he rejected further advances, but he claimed, and I'm going to add, he claimed that Falwell allegedly continued to pursue him, offering him gifts and sending him Facebook messages. Oh, that Becky Falwell continued to pursue him. And there was an exchange of highly seductive, inappropriate, I would say yes, pornographic Facebook communications. And seductive terms of lewd acts, and I'll leave it right there. It's X-rated communication. The former student says he sent a message in December of 2008 telling Falwell that he no longer wanted any romantic involvement with Becky Falwell. And then he said, allegedly, I mean, who knows whether he's saying is the truth or not. It could be totally the truth. I don't know. That's why I'm saying alleged. So, according to Politico magazine, another member of the former student's band came forward anonymously and said that the student told him about the sexual encounter with Becky Falwell within a month of after it happened. On Monday, Reuters, the giant news service, published an interview with Giancarlo Granda, who told the news organization about his years-long sexual relationship with Becky Falwell. He said that he first met the couple, Jerry and Becky Falwell, in March of 2012, while he was working as a pool attendant at the Fontainebleau Miami Beach Hotel, which is a very luxurious hotel in Miami Beach. And I'm going to censor a lot of that. Okay, now here's then the magazine article says, allegedly, Jerry Falwell officially resigned, Jerry Falwell Jr. officially resigned as Liberty University president on Tuesday and received a reported $10.5 million severance package in return. Okay, and it goes on and on and on, and there's other stuff, and it's not good. Okay, again, there is no way this behavior from a notable Christian leader and his wife, especially those entrusted with developing the Christian character of Christian college students. There's no way that this behavior is acceptable. There's no way it can be swept under the carpet. And without being legalistic, but at the same time being faithful to the Word of God, the Word of God demands that when a Christian leader, male or female, is caught in such an egregious violation of the scriptural commandments of Christian morality, that there needs to be a stepping down from your position. There needs to be it needs to be supervised by mature biblical pastors, and the goal is to redeem Jerry Falwell and his wife, okay, and bring them back into discipleship, bring healing, bring sanctification. That's the goal. That's the goal. The goal is not to, there's this expression, we as Christians kill our wounded. We have to remember the overall context. The overall context is not a justification for the sin. The overall context is that we live in a hypersexualized world. The overall context is we live in a hyper-pornographic world. The overall context is that we live in a pornographic or semi-pornographic saturation of our world, in which every believer in Jesus Christ, to whatever extent, minor, minimal, or whatever, is exposed in one way or another to blatant visual, audio messages of a pornographic nature. I don't know if that's what created the template for this sin or not. It may have just have been old-fashioned lust. The point is, though, the goal of disciplining a pastor or a Christian leader is to restore that Christian leader or pastor and his wife. In the same way, if you're disciplining an ordinary Christian, okay, the goal is not to destroy an ordinary Christian, but to discipline them in the expectation and hope that they can be restored, which simply means brought back in to a right relationship with Jesus Christ. The problem here, as you look at it, is that it's no accident that this lurid sexual affair of Falwell and his wife with the pool boy and others, it is not an accident that it comes out within weeks of a presidential election, because the media knows, and most people know, that Jerry Falwell was a public supporter of President Trump. So they're hoping to smear President Trump for Falwell and his wife Becky's sexual sins, because they hope that by discrediting Falwell for his hypocrisy, they hope to have some of that rub off on Trump. That, well, why would Trump accept the endorsement of such a corrupt pastor? Now, that's not really logical, and that's not really fair. You can't blame one man for the sins of another man, okay, or wife. But the problem is that from the standpoint of Christian discipline, and that's the hope. I mean, I'm not rejoicing and excusing their behavior. But if the discipline is Falwell has been asked to step down, I don't know what happened to his wife. I guess she's asked to step down too. But if he's walking away, and I could be wrong on the payout package, but he gets, according to some news sources, Falwell's getting $10.5 million to step down. And that may be part of the package, I think, works this way. The first year he steps down, he gets $2.5 million. The second year he steps down, he gets an additional $2.5 million. And then the total payout, I think, is $10.5 million. All right. when you've committed this kind of sin and you've been given this kind of responsibility, you shouldn't be thrown out to the dogs. You shouldn't be thrown out into the street begging for food. But a $10.5 million payout package seems rather luxurious for someone who is being disciplined. And so that doesn't really send a good message. I'm not saying you have to be naive. There needs to be a payout package that allows his family to be restored. I'm not sure $10.5 million sends that message. But the other point is, the reason that this scandal is being publicized now, don't think for a moment, this scandal was going on for a long time, so don't think for a moment that powerful people in the media did not know about it for years and years and years. But they strategically waited for the presidential election in which to blow it wide open, because they hope that this scandal will damage Trump, even though that's should be an irrational connection. So, how do you solve these problems? You have to have an overall biblical context, and that means we as Christians, Christian leaders or Christian individuals, when they're committing this level of sin in relationship to the level of the power they've been given, there has to be appropriate discipline, but also the goal of the discipline is not like some sadistic punishment. The goal of the discipline is to restore the Christian leader and his wife, no matter how lurid the sin is. The goal of the Christian discipline is not to be punitive for punitive's sake. The goal of the discipline is to restore the Christian leader and his wife into a right relationship with Jesus, to bring them to repentance, and to help guide them through repentance through strong biblical counseling. But the purpose of releasing this information is to break Christian support of Trump by trying to associate Trump with the sins of Jerry Falwell and his wife, Becky Falwell. All right, that's all I really want to say on that. I could say more, but understand that the surfacing of this lurid tale, they knew about this for a long time. This lurid tale was sat on until the appropriate moment, which is right before the election, and then to ignite it as kind of a moral time bomb to drive away Christian supporters of Trump. This is part of the warfare we're involved in. Now, on the other hand, Clinton and so many others on the left, who were Democrats, committed all kinds of sexual sins. 100 times more egregious and more evil and cruel and distasteful than what is being reported about the Falwells. And yet the media gives them a pass. With a conservative, a Republican, a Christian, there is no pass. So I wanted to leave it at that, but I wanted to give you perspective on the spiritual warfare, the timing of the Falwell expose, and how it relates to the upcoming election. See, we have to think strategically here, and thinking strategically does not mean sweeping sin under the carpet, but nor does it mean being so naive and not recognizing that the timing of the exposure is to do as much political damage to Trump as possible, even though he really has nothing to do with this. You're listening to the Paul McGuire Report. I'm holding in my hand a book called The Day the Dollar Died that I wrote a number of years ago. Copyright 2009. You need to get a copy, but it's a fast read. It's only a 182-page book. And in this book, I talk about Mark of the Beast technology, the day the dollar died, the plan to destroy America, and the specific agenda of the international bankers and the globalist elite in their specific plan to destroy Christians, conservatives, people who believe in patriotism, God, and country. We'll be back in just a moment. By the way, visit paulmcguire.us, spread this message far and wide, take advantage of all our free articles, free downloads, the Roku Channel, all our video channels, all our radio archives, and spread them far and wide. We really are in a heavy competition against computer bot censorship launched by the evil big tech companies. This is the Paul McGuire Report. Visit paulmcguire.us. We'll be back in a nanosecond. This is Paul McGuire. There is a global architecture. There is a global conspiracy that is being coordinated and financed by the wealthiest, most powerful people in the world, the globalist elite, the international bankers. So when you take, for example, what I expose in my book, The Greatest Battle for the Hearts and Minds of Mankind in the History of the World, I have a chapter entitled The Secret Plan Behind the UN Agenda 2030. Now, this secret plan behind the UN Agenda 2030 is designed to enslave the middle class and the working class, and the only people who will benefit are the 1%, the super rich, the super capitalists. And their goal is to use things like, these are lies, these are deceptive promises that they use, and I'll give you some of the words. You're familiar with the words. They promise that the UN Agenda 2030 is going to bring in a more sustainable, environmentally friendly world where social justice and a fair redistribution of wealth occurs. But in reality, as I say in my book, The Greatest Battle, nothing could be further from the truth. This is nothing less than a brutal and totalitarian global government takeover of every nation across the planet. The so-called positive goals of the UN Agenda 2030 document are nothing more than code words for a corporate government fascist agenda that will imprison humanity in a devastating cycle of poverty while enriching the world's most powerful elite and globalist corporations like Monsanto and DuPont. And I quote Michael Snyder's research in the book, and he exposes the truth about the goals of the UN Agenda 2030 and warns that nowhere does this document state that achieving human freedom is one of its goals. What he's trying to say is, this is not about human freedom. This is about enslaving everybody on planet Earth. This is about eventually using vaccine technology to inject a microchip, nanochip implant into every person's body on planet Earth. This is about a global dictatorship. And human freedom is not even a consideration. In contrast, the American Constitution with the Bill of Rights and the Declaration of Independence is all about human freedoms and rights, such as freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, so on and so forth. So we see that the European Union, the wealthiest people in the world, the UN Declaration of Human Rights, is nothing more than a giant Trojan horse to bring in this UN Agenda 2030, which is a blueprint for a globalist government by the elite and corporate interests. So when you get right down to it, who is financing Antifa, Black Lives Matter, all these radical groups. Who is financing the revolutions, the bombings, the burnings, the shootings? Who is financing the chaos? Who is financing the moral destruction of America? Who's financing all that? Well, the people and groups that are financing this global government under the guise of liberating people are the corporate interests and the globalist elite, the super rich or the wealthy 1%. And they use communist and Marxist principles as their subterfuge, as their masquerade to rob the middle class and the working class of any opportunity to make money. They want to take away any opportunity to achieve an American dream. They want to destroy your ability to work hard and prosper. They want you to be a cog in their giant machine. And eventually they want to enslave you by injecting a chip implant in your brain, whether you call it a neural implant or a nanochip implant or whatever you want to call it. And then you have electronic surveillance technology on a level that you've never seen before. And the total destruction of the middle class and the working class. That's what it's about. You think it's just political rhetoric when these radicals say we're coming for the suburbs, we're coming for the middle class and working class neighborhoods? They're dead serious. That has already been playing out for the last 20 or 30 years. I don't understand what's wrong with people. I really don't understand what's wrong with suburban housewives and Christian suburban housewives, etc. I have witnessed with my own eyes, growing up in New York City, living in Southern California. I began to notice this 20 years ago, just by using my eyes. And I noticed whenever they would build a nice neighborhood for working class people or middle class people, a nice neighborhood, a safe neighborhood, attractive neighborhood, not for the super rich, for the middle class and the working class. I began to notice that they would always put in low-income housing. It always was forced into any middle class, working class, suburban housing development. They would artificially insert low-income housing. Now, I'm not against low-income housing because I'm a racist. I grew up in New York City. I saw the results of government-controlled, artificially inserted low-income housing. We didn't live in a wealthy neighborhood. We lived in an average middle-class neighborhood in Jackson Heights, Queens. But when they would build these tall buildings that were financed by the government, it was to build low-income housing. So it would take all the people from the ghetto, and they would be put in these low-income housing structures that were deliberately forced into middle-class, working-class neighborhoods. And again, this is not racism. But what would happen is there would be massive increases of crime, rapes, robberies, drugs, gangs, shootings, break-ins, murders, flooding of middle-class and working-class neighborhoods with heroin and gangs. So these people would work a lifetime. Working-class people would work a lifetime in New York City to earn their own house in a working-class neighborhood that at least was safe and decent. Middle-class people would slave a lifetime to finally purchase a house in a decent middle-class neighborhood where they could raise their families in a safe environment. But very quickly after they did this, the government would come in and artificially inject low-income housing that they would never allow to be placed in the wealthy neighborhoods. This low-income housing is never allowed in wealthy, upper-class, elite, affluent neighborhoods. They would not allow low-income housing to be anywhere near their palatial homes, their very wealthy homes in neighborhoods. You see, the people that are always forced to receive the low-income housing are the hard-working working class and middle class. Now, there's nothing wrong with ethnic mixing, racial mixing, but it should not be under the control of a bureaucrat who isn't going to live in any of those neighborhoods. And so what would happen inevitably would be racial conflict. There would be murders. There would be heroin, hard drugs. All the problems of the ghetto, would now be artificially inserted and forced in the middle class and working class neighborhoods. So I notice this in California and across the nation today. You'll see a middle-class neighborhood, a working-class neighborhood, but you will now always see in the master planning of these so-called working-class suburbs, middle-class suburbs, what you will always see is the insertion artificially of low-income housing. And so it's not a matter of prejudice or racism. You suddenly see gangs hanging out in front of the supermarkets. You suddenly see drug dealers pulling up in front of high schools and schools selling drugs. You suddenly see an increase in rapes and shootings and robberies. And you definitely see a massive increase of working class kids and middle class kids being recruited into gangs and violence and heroin and all kinds of stuff. And then, all of a sudden, your kids are going to school not with kids that are dedicated to learning and hard work and stuff, but tragically, kids who are the victims of being exploited, addicted to heroin, addicted to meth, addicted to crack, getting your kids addicted, and the whole social structure falls apart. Yet, you can drive in the wealthier neighborhoods in New York or California, and you will never see the injection of low-income housing, because the wealthy are hypocrites. They won't put up with it. They won't put up with it. And they have the money to buy the politicians off. So this Agenda 2030, which claims to be this building of heaven on earth by using Marxist principles, is just a stealth attack by the globalist elite, the super rich, and the wealthy 1%. It's their, they claim that they're going to end poverty in all its forms everywhere. Look, I've lived through this stuff. I've lived through it. I've seen the housing developments built in New York City from when I was a little kid. Okay? I remember driving by the housing developments on the freeway with my father, and I would say, what are these? Because at a superficial glance, they were massive structures that superficially looked somewhat opulent. And my father would say they're housing developments. They're called the projects. So the term the projects referred to this government-built giant apartment buildings in major cities across the United States. The projects were, the projects were low-income housing. And I'd say, Dad, well, those buildings are nicer than the ones we built. And then he'd say, because structurally they were impressive, some of them. And he would say, you need to look carefully. And I'd say, what do you mean? He said, they made the buildings, the projects, the buildings may look nice from the outside, but the reality is they're filled with crime, gangs, drug deals, murders. And then as I got older in my teens, I would befriend. I had a lot of African-American friends. And the African-American friends I had told me of this expression. And this was black people who told me this expression. And it went like this. You can take people out. I think it went something like this. I'm messing it up. You can take people out of the ghetto, but you can never take the ghetto out of people. I think that's how it went. You can take people out of the ghetto and build them projects, but you can't take the ghetto out of the people. The idea is you can build these giant structures called the projects, low-income housing, to house people from the ghetto in the hope that you're going to give them a kind of, low-income utopia. But the reality is, unless there's a radical change in their mindset, in their hearts, in the programming of their mind, okay, they're simply going to be the beneficiaries of low-income housing, the beneficiaries of palatial low-income housing called the projects. But when you go into those projects, it's like a war zone. 11-year-old girls, 9-year-old girls being sold as prostitutes, crack addicts, meth addicts, violent gang members. And so I saw that happen in New York, and then I saw it happen in L.A., and I'd have my black friends in L.A. tell me the same thing. I could name the names of housing projects, which is just code for low-income housing, that were built all over the place in downtown Los Angeles. In ghetto neighborhoods, they built projects or low-income housing with fancy names. And the idea is that the government socialist bureaucracy was providing for them government housing, and they would have their piece of paradise. But what would happen within a matter of years is that these housing projects in LA and other cities across the United States became the most violent places on planet Earth, filled with gang members, heroin, meth, arsenals of guns, rapes, brutality. The older women, the mothers, the families are terrified, hiding behind locked doors. And these places, these so-called palatial low-income housing projects, became death zones and still are. I can't remember the names of the projects at the moment. A couple of years ago, I could have rattled them off to you. But any black person will tell you how bad they are. They are so dangerous that a black person won't even walk through them at the wrong time of day. I was in a very high-end housing project on Manhattan Island. This housing project, they were magnificent housing projects. And they were really palatial buildings. And they had a magnificent view of the Hudson River and the bridges. When you went inside them, they were very spectacular in many cases. And these buildings were deliberately built by the government to provide high-end, somewhat palatial apartment buildings at a low cost, which would allow both the middle class and the working class to live in Manhattan, because all the billionaires suck up all the real estate in Manhattan. It was up until the coronavirus, Manhattan was an enclave for billionaires. Well, I went into this apartment, and it was, the view was like the view of a billionaire. They were very nice apartments, and very nice people lived in them. No stereotypical. It was all kinds of racial groups, all kinds of ethnic groups. And one would have thought that with the building of these very nice buildings for low-income families or middle-class families, that things would go good. But no, it goes back to the old expression that my black friends taught me. You can take people out of the ghetto, but you can't take the ghetto out of people. So my first day there, I'm walking out of the building, and people who have very, good jobs with the city of Manhattan, etc. People who got some really high positions were living in these apartments, mixed with ordinary people. This was not a slum. It appeared that this could be, actually a workable thing. But I'm observing the people in the neighborhood, and I see a mixture And it's not based on race. It's based on lifestyle and values. I see a mixture of gang members, drug addicts, prostitutes, and criminals, and a mixture of city professionals, of people that have jobs, who have master's degrees and stuff. It's an eclectic mixture. And then I swear to God, this was my experience. I'm walking out of one of these apartments, and I'm walking down the street, and I see this green or black big heavy-duty garbage bag out of a can. This big black green garbage bag, you know what I'm talking about, is lying in the middle of the sidewalk. Everybody's ignoring it. Well, I don't know. I'm curious. So I walk by the bag, and guess what I see? I see a dead human body in the garbage bag. And then I call the cops. It's obvious that some gang member, because it's a random murder wouldn't bother to stuff somebody in a green garbage bag. Somebody stuffed in a green garbage bag after a hit. So somebody was killed, probably gang member shooting. And then after this person was killed, they may have even been killed in a different location. Somebody heaved the garbage bag, the plastic green garbage bag, onto this sidewalk near the street. So they probably pulled up a car real fast after killing somebody. And nobody noticed it. It just happened to be at a random chance. I walked by and looked, and there I saw the head of a dead body. And the dead body looked like it had been placed there, sometime during the night. And I called the cops. And then I spoke to the person who invited me to see their apartment. I just gently warned them. I said, I know you're very happy with this housing and stuff, but you need to really think about what's happening in this neighborhood. Is it really as safe as you think it is? Because, I've only been here one day, okay, and I've never walked by a dead body in a garbage bag in any neighborhood that I've been in. Sobering reality. Why did it happen? Because no matter how much money you spend to fix the problem, and that's what socialism and Marxism does, money alone is important in fixing a problem. No question about it. But you've got to change people's souls and their minds. You see, when you have families that are broken down, when you have the plague of heroin addiction or whatever addiction, when you have the plague of gangs, and this was obviously a byproduct of gang warfare, what you're doing is seeing the government spending billions of dollars in what they call government project buildings, and then it turns into a ghetto within a year. And all my black friends, African American friends, male and female, they all understood this. They educated me to this dynamic, whereas all my liberal white friends were clueless. You're listening to the Paul McGuire Report. I'm Paul McGuire. Visit paulmcguire.us. This is the plan, by the way. I'm not trying to get political, but this is the Biden plan. It doesn't work. It never has worked. You're listening to the Paul McGuire Report. This is Paul McGuire. I'm looking at research in front of me right now, and there's dozens of articles about America's worst housing project. And it's located in Los Angeles. Housing projects, these are government-built housing projects, supposedly to provide great low-income housing. But they turn into projects which turn into ghettos filled with gangs and drugs. So here's some of them. The violence-ridden neighborhood of Watts, where they had the Watts riots years ago. Jordan Downs. It says Jordan Downs is comprised of 103 spookily identical buildings in the low-income, violence-ridden neighborhood of Watts. San Fernando Gardens. Ramona Gardens, East LA's housing project. They call them gardens. Ramona Gardens. On and on and on. And then they show images of them and with all the gang members. So, Imperial Courts projects, worst housing projects in Los Angeles. See, these are all failures. Most dangerous housing projects in Los Angeles. Number 1, Avalon Gardens. Number 2, Estrada Courts. Number 3, Gonzac Village. Number 4, Imperial Courts. Number 5, Jordan Downs. Number 6, Mar Vista Gardens. Number 7, Nickerson Gardens. Number 8, Pueblo del Rio project. So the point is that you have all these politicians for socialism and Marxism, and it's the socialist and Marxist mentality that just throws money at problems. And as my black friends told me, you can take the ghetto, you can take people out of the ghetto, but you can't take people out of the ghetto, but you can't take the ghetto out of people's hearts and minds. You've got to rebuild people's hearts and minds. You've got to give them an education that's applicable. You got to empower them. You can't just throw money at it. That doesn't work. That's a lack of love. And that's not. So yes, we need to help our brothers and sisters, but not by replicating ghettos, by strategically building environments of opportunity, etc. Now, I want to say this. What is causing this to perpetuate against all logic, reason, and science? Why does this dynamic continue over and over again? Well, I'll expose to you the secret. This is the great secret that should be taught in every college and university. This should be common understanding for Christians, because you can't understand anything about the society you live in unless you understand these dynamics. I wrote about it in my book, The Day the Dollar Died, which you can get at paulmcguire.us. Here's a chapter from my book, The Day the Dollar Died, entitled Bankers Bankroll the Red Revolution, or the Communist Revolution. And I'm just going to read you a few sentences so you understand what this is all about. The Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, by the way, which was the Communist Revolution in Russia. The words can be used interchangeably. This occurred in 1917. The Bolshevik or Communist Revolution in Russia was built on the big lie that communism would liberate the oppressed masses. School textbooks teach that communism was successful because the people were suffering under the oppression of the czars. They were like the kings, the royal family of Russia. When the Communist Revolution began, the communist leader Lenin was in exile in Switzerland. Trotsky, another big communist leader, was also in exile as a reporter for a communist newspaper on the Lower East Side of New York City. When the Tsar lost his power in Russia, the Bolshevik communists were not a significant political force in Russia. The communists did not come to power because the exploited masses of Russia wanted them. The communists were sent in by very powerful capitalist bankers from the United States and Europe. The communist leader Lenin was secretly sent across Europe, which was at war, in a, quote, sealed train, a sealed railroad train. Lenin was given $5 to $6 million in gold, which must be worth hundreds of millions, probably worth 500 million today. The secret operation was planned by the German High Command and Max Warburg, the brother of Paul Warburg, who created the Federal Reserve in the United States. Meanwhile, Trotsky sailed from Manhattan aboard the SS Christiana on March 27, 1917, which is the year of the Bolshevik Revolution. Trotsky came with 300 trained revolutionaries that they paid for, just like these white boys in Antifa. They're paid thugs. Same game plan. We're going back to 1917. when Trotsky met up with Lenin, they failed to get the people to follow them, kind of like today. So they hired a private army of criminals and thieves. Lenin called them all power to the Soviets. The Communist Army, including criminals, captured a few key cities such as Petrograd. From there, it took years to take control of Russia. The Communist Revolution was not an uprising of oppressed workers. It was financed by an army of thugs paid for by international bankers. Without bankers like Warburg, Rockefeller, Rothschild, Harriman, that's Bush family, Alfred Milner, J.P. Morgan, the banker, J.P. Morgan Trust, and Jacob Schiff, another banker, there would not have been a communist revolution. Paul Warburg in the United States and his brother Max Warburg in Germany financed the communist revolution. A relative of the Warburgs, Jacob Schiff, was a senior partner in Kuhn, Laub and Company. Max Warburg ran the Rothschild Allied Family Bank of Frankfurt, Germany. Jacob Schiff helped to finance Leon Trotsky. Jacob Schiff reportedly spent about $20 million financing the communist revolution. Another banker, Lord Alfred Milner, eventually organized the secret organization known as the Round Table, which was backed by Lord Rothschild. What was the motive behind the financing of the communist revolution? First, the international bankers wanted to control the geographic territory of Russia, along with all its natural resources, including oil. Secondly, the communist government would have to pay the money that was loaned to them, plus millions of dollars in interest. Finally, the international bankers now controlled a nation that they could use to threaten and invade other nations. Through the use of the Hegelian dialectic, Russia became the antithesis. Adolf Hitler's fascism became the thesis, and now they could move the nations like America and England into a new kind of synthesis. This synthesis would become the world's socialist government, which is emerging before us. Socialism is about total control and the consolidation of power and money. Nowhere in the world will you see a communist revolution which has liberated the oppressed workers and redistributed the wealth. In every communist nation, without exception, you see the super-rich elite class ruling over the masses of downtrodden people who are treated like slaves. Moscow has more billionaires living in that city than anywhere else in the world, with the exception of New York City. However, the masses live in poverty. The idea of a worker's paradise is bait to mobilize the masses. And then in the following chapter, I have the international bankers bankroll Hitler. And I talk about in 1922 how National Socialism, that was Hitler's brand of socialism, was emerging in Germany. A railroad tycoon, W. Averill Harriman, that's Bush family, traveled to Berlin and met with the Thyssen family. That's a big, giant German corporation that financed Hitler. One of the most powerful banking families in Germany. The idea was to establish some kind of German U.S. bank so they could transfer their money from Germany into the U.S. Fritz Thyssen wrote a book called I Paid Hitler and donated money to the newly created German National Socialist Workers' Party. Financing from the Thyssen family was the key to Hitler's mysterious rise to power. Thyssen controlled the German Steel Trust, a steel industry consortium founded by Clarence Dillon, one of Wall Street's most powerful investors. One of Dillon's partners was Samuel Bush, who was Prescott Bush's father, George Sr.'s grandfather, and great-grandfather of former U.S. President George W. Bush. W. Averill Harriman and the Thyssens decided to establish a bank and appointed George Herbert Walker, Prescott's father-in-law, as president. In 1926, they started the Union Banking Corporation, UBC, with Prescott Bush. It goes on and on. And then it talks about the infusion of money from the Rockefellers through Standard Oil, Chase Bank, U.S. automobile companies. It is alleged that the Union Banking Corporation became a secret channel that enabled Nazi money to enter the U.S., and Brown Brothers Harriman would send back funds as the Nazis needed capital. Although unsubstantiated, some have said that the Bush family's fortune is connected to supporting Adolf Hitler. Like the Communist Revolution, Hitler could not have come to power without the help of the international bankers, many of them based in the United States and England. Now, I get a lot deeper into it, the role of the Illuminati, and how the Illuminati really founded the Communist Manifesto. What am I trying to say to you in my book, The Day the Dollar Died, which you can get at paulmcguire.us? When you look at the riots and the violence in the streets of America, when you look at the chaos in the political parties, when you look at anarchy, Marxism, this is not happening by accident. This is being financed like previous Marxist socialist revolutions. Everything you're seeing on television, including the 24/7 attacks on Donald Trump, everything you're seeing is being financed by a super wealthy globalist elite, a collection of international bankers, the 1%, and let's not forget, most importantly of all, they are an occult elite. It's up to you to gain knowledge. Knowledge is power. You either gain knowledge or you're going to live in a totalitarian state. And it's right on the horizon. We either make the right choices, we either function as law-abiding citizens who participate in the political process by being informed and voting, or you can kiss America, you can kiss your freedoms, you can kiss your Christianity, you can kiss your family goodbye. It's time for suburban women to wake up and be educated and not just think emotionally, not just allow their emotions to be manipulated. Because it's just because it's some cute actor from Hollywood who seems like a nice guy telling you to do this, that, and the other. Unless you have knowledge, you're going to be taken to the cleaners. And your children are going to suffer, and you're going to suffer. It's time to wake up. And most of all, it's time for the church, the true Bible-believing church in America to wake up. We either wake up and have a great awakening, or we stay asleep and we will have a totalitarian dictatorship more demonic than anything you could possibly imagine. This is Paul McGuire. Visit paulmcguire.us. This is an emergency alert. Spread it far and wide.